Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam Sargeant. I've got the 9 a.m. Pacific slot or noon on the East Coast, and very excited to be with you today for TransitCon and really appreciate the invitation. Hopefully you can see my screen and my slides here, and I'm going to be talking about ridership revenue and relevancy, which is really an operator's perspective on recovery in transit across the United States. And my name is Sam Sargeant. I serve as the Director of Strategy and Planning at CALTRAIN. And I have been with the agency for about 10 months now, but previously I was with Capital Metro in my hometown of Austin, Texas for about 7.5 years during a really formative time in that growing city's life, and in particular, getting to work in transit in that time was incredibly exciting. But I got the opportunity out here in the Bay Area, working under our executive director, Michelle Bouchard, and it is a challenging but incredibly exciting time to be in transit in the Bay Area. So let's get started. So most of you, or many of you, who are in the room today are either in urban spaces or love urban spaces, and obviously San Francisco is one of this country's, and I would say the world's, great urban spaces. And you see here we've got this beautiful image looking down Market Street. And San Francisco, certainly for a Western city, not being on the East Coast, 18,634 people per square mile. It is incredibly dense. And so nobody, I don't think, here needs to scold San Francisco for being less dense or not having as much density as many American cities, certainly coming from Austin, which was, I think, about 1,600 people per square mile. But it is a very dense place. And we operate on a very dense corridor, but still, I'm frequently reminded, especially when you start seeing traffic kick back up in the Bay Area, how much the geometry of transit matters. And I know that this matters greatly to Hayden, and most of us have probably seen his great social media posts about the footprints of urban spaces around the world and how efficient and inefficient they can be. I'm sure most people who are listening today have seen this series of images, but I always like to recap it, and in particular, coming from Texas, where a lot of what I was doing was selling transit as a concept and trying to build a culture of transit in my hometown where it's not thought of as a utility in the way that I think it is in the Bay Area, and it certainly is in the East Coast and elsewhere around the world. But you look at a city block here, and you look at these 50 people who all fit onto this bus. Then you see them all on bikes, pretty efficient. Obviously, they're not in motion, but that's still a really efficient way to move people around a city. And then you see that same group of people in their cars. I also like to remind people, and I know that I'm not the foremost expert on this, but many of you may be, but still, being a transit operator, I also like to remind people that a lot of the wonderful technologies that are out there are not going to be catch-all solutions to the issues facing our urban spaces. In particular, how do we make best use of urban spaces so that the highest number of people can enjoy their lives and can afford to live in our cities. And technology will do a lot of things, and I'll touch on what telework is doing in particular. But you've got EVs, TNCs like Uber and Lyft, and AVs. And while they may make certain efficiencies in terms of geometry, they just don't solve that fundamental problem of putting enough people into finite amounts of space and then moving them around so that they can build lives around the mobility systems in those cities, transit in particular. When you think about what CALTRAIN does on our corridor, and I'll touch on what CALTRAIN is and what we do here in just one slide, but even in our current gallery cars that you see here, the silver ones or these Bombardier bi-levels, we're talking about 840 people on a 6-train consist. And so that takes up about 5,100 square feet. And you think of a city block on the previous slides, that's about 100,000 square feet. So with the fact that we're able to put 840 people seated on one of our 6 train consists is a pretty efficient way of moving human beings. And I will touch on our new electrified vehicles here in a moment, but it's a pretty efficient way to move people. And where we move people, 77 miles between San Francisco and San Jose, and then on down to the city of Gilroy, running through the heart of Silicon Valley, 31 stations, 20 cities, and 3 counties. We've got about 3.5 million people in our service area, which we call the Peninsula, for those of you who are not as familiar with the Bay Area. And right now we're running 104 trains per weekday on that single 77-mile line and 32 on weekends. What I think is particularly exciting about working for CALTRAIN is that we're on the verge of completely overhauling our entire fleet and electrifying our fleet. And we are also, and this is the heart of my talk here today, we're also working to recover in what I would term the least recovered region in the United States in terms of people getting back into their pre-pandemic commute patterns on the least recovered mode, commuter rail. And so we have a heavy lift ahead of us, and we are thinking through a number of ideas, along with a lot of the other operators in the Bay Area, which I will also touch on here in just a moment. But what's exciting to me is that we have a 160-year-old asset on our corridor. The Southern Pacific stood this up during the Civil War, and it's been operating ever since. And yet at the same time, we are really in startup mode in many ways. We've got our first ever standalone executive director. We've got a fantastic new executive team that I'm very fortunate to be a part of. And we've got a board made up of 9 members from our 3 counties, San Francisco, San Mateo County, and Santa Clara County to the south, who I think understand that we are in startup mode, both in terms of recovery and in terms of our technology. So these are pulled from two other folks. These are not CALTRAIN graphics, but for those of you, again, who are not from the Bay Area, you see here on the left, we've got a diagram of what our service looks like. So you've got our operation running from our terminus in the north at 4th and King, going down to San Jose Diridon, and then we have our line that extends down with slightly more limited service down to Gilroy on the left. And we run a number of different types of services, both local, limited stop, and our quote baby bullet service, which is the least, has the most limited stops of our services, and it works during the AM, PM peak times. And then you can see just a slice actually of the transit ecosystem in the Bay Area. And so you can see here CALTRAIN on that red dotted line running from San Francisco all the way down to Gilroy at the bottom of the screen. But there are 27 agencies in our 9-county, 7.5 million person region. And CALTRAIN is one of the larger, but certainly not the largest in the region. But our line overlaps with many other partners. And it's fantastic in terms of the amount of infrastructure and the amount of service in this region, but we're still getting better at making these systems all work together. And now getting at the theme of recovery, again, in a region that has been very slow to return to office, has seen some population decline in certain areas, not all, and has many operators, including CALTRAIN, looking at some pretty sobering revenue projections right now that we're also working through solutions on. But it's a complex environment that CALTRAIN works in. So what are the 3 R's of transit? I put this in the title of my presentation when I submitted it to Hayden. And as I see it, and I have the good fortune of getting to work with many, many of my peers across the United States, I really got to know a lot of great folks in this industry, both on the agency side, on the advocacy side, on the academic side, in consulting, and just customers. When I was in Austin, and certainly now that I'm in a transit-rich environment like the Bay Area, and most agencies struggle with these 3 things, and they're interrelated: ridership, revenue, and relevancy. And right now, as many agencies are working through their post-pandemic or whatever you would call it, the pandemic recovery, ridership is back for many, many agencies that are in cities that have seen a higher level of return to work. That stands to reason. You also see higher recovery at our agencies that run service for those who cannot afford to have their own private vehicle, or are in places where the land use lends itself much better to riding transit as a way of life and not having a single occupancy vehicle in your garage most of the time. But many agencies that are bus heavy have seen the ridership come back. Then you've got revenue. For those of us who work at places like CALTRAIN, where we were commute based, had a somewhat higher fare that was oftentimes paid by employers, you've got revenue that has lagged in parallel with your ridership decline. But then you've got my former employer, as an example, Capital Metro, a lot more typical to a Sunbelt, Southern, Western type of agency where there's 1 penny of sales tax that funds it. That penny is very strong in Austin's situation, and it runs a lot of bus plus 1 commuter rail. And then, as many of you probably know, there will eventually be a robust light rail system on top of all of that. But revenue and ridership in many agencies, they're sort of divorced from one another. You've got a higher subsidy, so low ridership doesn't necessarily mean low revenue. Then you've got CALTRAIN, which had the highest fare box recovery in the United States at about 76% in 2019. BART was not too far behind, and a lot of our East Coast peers were in that same higher level. So our revenue and our ridership are completely linked to one another. And then you've got relevancy. And I find this to be very interesting, especially being a transit professional who's made the transition from Austin, where I think that Capital Metro has a fantastic reputation, but the relevancy is what was always something that the very talented team there was always trying to work on, was how to make transit matter to people, how to make it feel relevant when they don't use it often or at all. And so that was a very heavy lift. And then you've got the Bay Area, like Chicago, like the East Coast, and probably a couple of other places in the United States, and certainly in North America, where the relevancy and the need for transit is not really called into question, even if ridership and revenue are low. It's seen as a utility. You may not, it's like power and water or all kinds of other things that you, power and water probably not being great examples, but all the other trappings of an urban space that you just kind of take for granted but know you need. Parks, libraries, schools, especially if you don't have kids, you still think, well, that matters, that's worth investing in. So these things are interrelated, and the way that agencies have recovered, some of them have skewed more in one direction than another, but how do we transit agencies, find that balance and move into the rest of this decade and beyond? And for CALTRAIN, it's a particularly pronounced issue with ridership and revenue. So here's a little snapshot again. I'm going to provide the CALTRAIN perspective because we are at the far end of non-recovery in many ways. We are recovering, but we're just not recovering at the same speed as many of our other peers around the United States. So you can see the ridership going up and up and up over the years, and in particular in the middle part of the last decade, and then topping out around 63,000, 64,000 in 2019 average weekday. We also were very unique, and we're very fortunate to have a robust bidirectional commute because of the fact that we've got 2 major cities on either end of the line and Silicon Valley in the middle. And then you see the precipitous drop off from the pandemic. I don't even think that 2020 number does this justice, because the drop was really closer to 98% right at first. And then we start seeing a slow recovery back up to where we are now. We still hover, we are getting closer to 20,000 average weekday, running 104 trains per day. But pre-pandemic, CALTRAIN was predicting eclipsing the 100,000 average weekday rider mark before 2030. That was in our business plan, and the idea was we will electrify, we will increase service, and based on demand, here's what we're looking at for the end of this decade. As I mentioned, we had one of the highest, if not the highest, fare box recovery in the United States at about 75%, whereas most American transit operators require significantly more subsidy. And many of you may be in markets where you will hear, when you advocate for transit, well, why can't you be more like a business? And subsidy is almost seen in many places as a bad word. And I will close on this by saying, I think that we really need to work as an industry and also as advocates and customers of transit to move away from that. And I'll I'll mention why here in just a couple of minutes. Thankfully, here on the peninsula in our 3-county service area, to ensure continuity of operations, voters here approved a 1/8 cent sales tax that effectively made up the loss of our fare revenue, as it dropped and as we were hovering at about 20-25% of pre-pandemic ridership and revenue, those two things being very linked together here at CALTRAIN. So thankfully, voters here not only passed it, but got over California's 2/3 threshold in order to do so. And that's allowed us to keep operating and to build for our recovery. Right now, FY24 fare box recovery is about 26% of our annual operating budget, and our recovery is in the 26% to 30% range in terms of ridership at the moment. So going back to the Bay Area transit ecosystem, I showed you that great map that Ian Griffith from Seamless Bay Area had put together. But you can see here in this chart the sort of uneven recovery across the Bay Area. And this would be very similar if I had pulled a number of my peers from around the country, especially if it was a healthy mix of commuter heavy, a mixed mode agency like, say, LA Metro, or a bus heavy agency like AC Transit, where there's also a high degree of need and a lot of folks who do not own cars. But you can see here that CALTRAIN, like BART, is at the lower end of the recovery spectrum. BART also being pretty reliant, at least traditionally, and they are making changes right now to try to meet the new market, just as CALTRAIN is, but pretty heavily reliant on commuters. And then you can see some slower recovery at SFMTA, although they run a very robust bus and light rail service that has recovered fairly well, but the financial district is still not recovered, as same with mid-market and south of market. And then VTA and Samtrans, you start ticking up and up and up. And then you've got a couple of other bus heavy agencies like Marin Transit as well, which has had a really healthy recovery. So it's a mix, but those commuter heavy operators are on the low end of the recovery, at least for now. But you can see here that the Bay Bridge, San Mateo Bridge, and then the 101, which is a north-south freeway here in the Bay Area, they've recovered to 75, even 90, and on some days 100% of pre-pandemic. So people are traveling again. They're traveling differently, but they're traveling, and they're traveling through some of the main arteries for commuter traffic in particular. And so the question is, how do we get them back onto our transit services? Looking at San Francisco through a couple of other lenses, not just transit, you can see economic recovery index here based on jobs, people, investment, economic activity, and cost of living. Austin, where I came from, has essentially, in many ways, did not feel like it had gone through the trauma, at least economically, that many other cities in the United States have. Of course, the pandemic still hit Austin, and it was indeed a trauma. But you can see here the recovery lagging in some of our denser cities in the United States, San Francisco in particular, and then mobile phone activity as well. You have 800,000 people still living in San Francisco, but it is not ballooning to 1.5 or 2 million like it would have on a typical weekday in, say, 2019. Also, economically and culturally, the Bay Area is uniquely enabled for hybrid and remote work. Technology has advanced everywhere, but I think the Bay Area was always ahead of the curve in terms of hybrid work, and in particular, having such a technology-heavy economy. But you can see some of the office reentry rate here, even in a tech town like Austin, still much higher percentage of people heading back to the office compared to San Francisco. And then job postings. So looking here, JLL, commercial real estate firm, did this graphic for the Commuter Rail Coalition meeting back in November. But many of the postings in the Bay Area are also 100% remote if people want to be, and many companies still have not renewed their lease or gone back to their buildings. And that's a huge issue. The lack of movement and the lack of a commute, especially for CALTRAIN, is something that requires a lot of pause and a lot of thought. And then, of course, the share of remote workers by commuter zone is uneven across the United States. You can see here in places that are more rural, in particularly in the South and the Midwest, you just don't have as many people who are remote workers. Some of that may be the nature of their work, some of it may be cultural. I would say the Bay Area, like Austin, is a lot more democratic, small d democratic, of a working environment, where when employees say that they would prefer to work X number of days, they tend to get more power to do so. Whereas in some more traditional metro areas, if a boss says come back into the office, people come back into the office. But you can see it's pretty uneven. I do always like to note, and I know that everybody here knows this, but I will oftentimes hear people say, well, that's going to be a pretty heavy lift, CalTrain, or whatever the transit agency might be, to get your ridership back, because people are not going back to the office, or quote, everybody is working remotely. And I would caution people on that, because as we all know, many of the people who make our economies and our lives work do not have the option of working remotely. And so even in a remote work heavy community like San Francisco, you can see this telework share is still surprisingly low, because we have so many people who are conductors and engineers on CalTrain, or who are in the service industry, or who are nurses, doctors in fabrication plants, who are at hotels, you name it, teachers. And so I always caution people that yes, this has been a huge impact on commuter transit and transit in particular, but at the same time, there is still so many people out there who just don't have the option to work from home. And I think, especially for CalTrain, where we used to have a ridership that was probably more affluent, running through a fairly affluent corridor, a lot of tech workers, we need to recreate ourselves to meet the needs of people who are less affluent and who cannot work from home. And so that's part of our challenge, is how do we design schedules? How do we design regionally fare structures that better allow for that? So taking a look at our CalTrain data too, we know how our ridership is changing, not just in terms of a percentage of pre-pandemic and the slight uptick that we continue to see. We are recovering just slowly, but the nature of those trips is that it's not 5 day a week. We can see now that the rides that are 4 times per week or more are about 38%, more lower income riders, which I think is a good thing, and more customers who do not have access to a car, and then more students, which I think is an incredibly good thing. So ridership revenue and relevancy, again, you could also swap out relevancy for reputation, but I think that CalTrain is in a fortunate position to have a very strong reputation and to be seen as relevant in our market, but we are chasing that ridership and revenue equation. And so there are a number of ways that we're working to improve this and make sure that we can keep providing top-notch service to this community and connecting with VTA, with AC Transit, with Samtrans, with Muni, with BART, with other mobility providers, including private shuttles and on-demand services and bikes and pads. So we've got to make some changes. And while I know this is not going to be a catch-all, I do want to tell you about, in case you didn't know, that CalTrain is transitioning to a 90% electric fleet from a fleet of aging, but reliable, but aging diesel locomotives and our 1985 built gallery cars. And so this is an enormous, enormous project. This is swapping out the beating heart of this railroad. And it's not something that most agencies, whether it's a rail agency or a bus agency, do with this amount of speed. I think almost every bus agency is swapping over to zero emission. Rail is doing the same for those who are not already light rail and zero emission. But on the commuter side, a little bit slower to make the change, and we're doing it fairly quickly and fairly dramatically. So 51 miles of electrified territory between San Francisco and San Jose, to $2.44 billion program that will go into revenue service in September of 2024. And this will also allow us not just to run a quieter, cleaner, more reliable, more frequent, honestly, service for our current customers, but also for our future customers, i.e. our off-board community members. And so this is also going to likely coincide with more of a redistribution of service to try to meet the needs of the current market. and is going to be an incredible customer experience. I've had the chance to be on these vehicles a number of times. I think for any of you who are able to make it out to the Bay Area or live in the Bay Area in the fall of next year, I hope that we'll be able to see you on board, because these are really, really beautiful vehicles. It's an incredible ride, and it's just going to do so much good for the communities that are up and down our corridor, replacing, call it 80 years of 70, 80 years of diesel with these beautiful vehicles. But on the ridership front, I think one of the big strategies that we are pursuing, that many other agencies have pursued, especially ones that used to have a big AM and PM focus on their schedules, is redistributing our trips to best serve our non-peak customers, who we believe are principally service workers, medical, nurses, doctors, also special event service, where we've seen incredibly healthy ridership recovery. I mentioned special event because I think that that's a really important way to get people on board for the first time and show them what transit is and what it is not. Redoubling our efforts to influence development and land use, even in a very dense corridor. How can we make more out of the small parcels that we have, but also that partners have, to build better transit-oriented communities, and developing new fare products to meet the needs of the Bay Area's new type of commuter. So my former boss and CEO in Austin, Randy Clark, is now the general manager at WMATA in DC. And I know that they've pushed a 3-day pass, which has been very popular, flexible, works in DC in particular for a lot of tourists and people there in business, but also the people who are going for a 3-day-a-week commute, because otherwise you may have a lot of people who balk at buying a 7-day pass, let alone a 31-day pass. Revenue, driving our ridership recovery, that's probably the most important thing to us, is how many human beings we move. But at the same time, we don't want all of our revenue recovery to be on the backs of our customers. So ridership is a big part of the revenue growth, but we also need to continue building a resilient coalition to ensure a higher chance of success for not only grants, which we've been very successful with lately to close out the electrification project, but also for ballot measures. And many of you may have been following this, but there is a robust coalition that's been in place for some time, but I think is really being reinvigorated right now in the Bay Area, to not only search for gap funding from the state for, call it a 1 to 3 to 4 year period, but also gearing up towards a 2024 or likely 26 regional measure to make sure that we don't fall into this situation again, not being able to predict the future, and making sure we've got a good amount of healthy revenue coming in for our transit operators in the future, not from farebox. And designing a business model that's more balanced. I mentioned again this idea that we hear probably in many of our cities and in our communities of, well, why can't transit be more like a business? Why do you need so much subsidy? And I would say transit is a public good, and it's a public service. And I don't think that we say the same things about many other things that government provides to people. And I like to say, especially when I was back in Texas, that, if somebody says, well, there's an empty bus, it means that you've got a failed transit system. I would say, no, if that's a reliable, clean, accessible, inviting, on-time bus, and it is there when people need it, that's a success. And I usually would use the example of, does somebody who has a well-maintained, beautifully built library with well-stocked books and computers in their community, do they think that that library is a failure if there are less people in it than they would like to see, or a park, or a school, or let's even say a highway for the sake of argument? People don't say that they're failed because they don't make up 100% of their revenue through fees. So we've got to get people to move away from that, look at transit as a public good that needs some amount of reliable subsidy, so that when we see dips in revenue, we're not in serious financial straits. And then relevancy. I said CALTRAIN is in a very good place in terms of our reputation and relevancy, and we just need to make sure that we continue providing safe, reliable, and accessible service. But it's something that we need to be cognizant of every single day, and we need to make sure that we're speaking up for our partners at other agencies to tell the great story of transit and why this matters. So I know that I'm right up at the end of our time, but you can see my email address down here, sargeant@caltrain.com, and I hope that you'll drop me a message, and happy to answer any questions and connect there. Hayden, and to everybody here in the TransitCon universe, really appreciate the time. This is really fun.